and good afternoon, everybody. It is great to see familiar names and familiar faces arriving on my screen from yesterday. We are looking forward to another thought-provoking and enriching session today. More about that in a moment, but first of all, I'm going to pass to David Lonsdale, one of the Power of the Word team, because I know that he would like to say a few words to just welcome you today and also to look ahead to what we're going to cover. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone, whatever is appropriate, and welcome to the second day of our Power of the Word conference on the call of literature. I hope you had a good night's sleep. I've been asked to say a few words by way of introduction to today's order of play. If you'll pardon the expression, it's Wimbledon fortnight. If yesterday was mainly about the call of poetry, today we're focusing our attention mostly on narrative. The first keynote event is Plenary, a new documentary on the life and work of the American novelist and short story writer Flannery O'Connor, premiering this week to several European audiences. The producers are Mark Bosco and Elizabeth Kaufman, and it's a pleasure for me to offer them a warm welcome to them and their colleagues. The film will be followed by a roundtable discussion entitled Flannery, Literary Journey to the Province of Joy. And in this roundtable discussion, Mark will be joined by his colleagues Michael Murphy and Angela O'Donnell. No Dublin conference would be complete without James Joyce. So in the second keynote event of the day, Irish writer and scholar Declan Kiberd will speak on the subject of the new Bloom Usalem, Ulysses as a Sacred Text, ? The image of journey, explicit in the title of Flannery O'Connor's roundtable discussion, and implicit, one would think, in any discussion of Ulysses, also finds a place in the short papers for today's discussion in the breakout sessions. We have, for example, an account of Goethe's travels from Weimar to Rome and its transformative impact on the author. French writer Michel Houellebecq's dystopian novel Soumission traces the progression of its protagonist Francois to a state of, quote, neoliberal consumerist exhaustion and conversion to Islam. The central character of Irish playwright Enda Walsh's installation is a man who has dedicated his life to traveling from door to door in order to spread the good word, and is now confined to his hotel room as he lies dying. Newman's novel Callista recounts its protagonist's journey from paganism to Christianity, a journey which also crosses borders of African, Eastern, and Western worlds. So from one point of view, the image of journey is central to today's proceedings, but it's only one element, it's only one image in a rich selection. There is much else to explore, and so I won't detain you any longer. Thank you.
David, thank you. Thank you for setting the scene in that way. I'm sure you'll agree there's plenty to look forward to over the course of the next few hours. How we'd like to start is kind of building on something that those of you that were with us yesterday, we heard you really enjoyed, which is just the opportunity really to connect with some of your colleagues from around the world who are here today. So we're going to do that with some more of this kind of informal networking in the small breakout groups, short conversations, but just a chance to say hello if it's someone you haven't met before, to reconnect with somebody you perhaps haven't seen for a while, to share what you found really fascinating from yesterday, what perhaps you're looking forward to today. So Scott, if you wouldn't mind opening those breakout rooms, please. We have an enjoyable conversation. And there we go, you're gradually coming back. My screen rearranging. There we go. I think that's everybody. Welcome back. So we hope that that was an enjoyable way to kind of ease into today's session of the conference. Plenty more opportunities to connect over the course of the next few days. Before we move on, just a brief reminder of how we're going to work together when we're working online like this. It's fabulous, actually. I barely need to say this, but it's great to see so many cameras on. We would love you to keep them on over the course of the afternoon. It's so connection, I think, is really important the way we're living at the moment, and to see someone's face is just such a much more human connection than one of the Zoom black rectangles with a white name in. And certainly as a speaker, it's so much more encouraging to be able to see people's reaction as you're speaking, rather than the rather dispiriting blank screen. So thank you for having your cameras on. We will keep microphones muted when we're in plenary like this, just to cut down on the background noise. But please don't worry about any interruptions, any technical difficulties. They are just part of the rich tapestry of life at the moment. And I think probably as we've been facilitating online workshops over the past year and a half, we've pretty much seen it all. My favorite being cats, who seem to like to make an appearance on screen. So I'm almost hoping that we get a cat this afternoon. It would be helpful, looking around, I think it's looking pretty good, but if you could just check that your Zoom name is the name that you would like us to call you, so that if it comes to an open floor and we're kind of inviting you to speak, we don't call you by the wrong name. There, in the 3 dots in the corner of your screen, you can rename yourself if you need to. That always happens to me if the kids have been on the computer overnight. We would love you to share your thoughts and ideas over the course of this conference. We are really keen to hear from you. And there are several ways that is kind of possible to do. One of those is the open floor sessions that you experienced yesterday and that we'll be having more of today, which is an opportunity to actually say something to the whole group. There's also the chat function that will be enabled during those plenary sessions. So perhaps if, as you're listening to somebody who's speaking, something occurs to you, there's a link that you'd like to share or just an idea that it's sparked for you, then please do add that into chat. And then we also have the conference tabula. So Scott is going to, he's put the link into chat. Thank you, Scott, but also just going to share his screen, I think, to show you what this looks like. I guess if we were face to face, this would be a big board in the atrium of our glorious conference venue, and you would be able to write ideas and thoughts on post-it notes and add it to that board. So this is our online version of that. You can see by clicking on the post-it note icon on the left-hand side of the screen, you can then add a post-it note into any of these sections. You can zoom in and you can type your comment onto that post-it note. Beautifully done, Scott. You mind just zooming out so that we can just talk through the 6 sections that are on that tabula, please. So you can see we've got different coloured areas for your ideas. One for feedback on the conference and how it's working, because we're keen to make this work for you. So if something isn't working, let us know and we can modify it as we go along. I'll come down to the bottom, resources. If there's particular links or resources that you would like to share that you think it would be useful to others to know about, then that's somewhere that you can make a note of those. If there are connections that you'd like to make, so it might be that you have a very brief conversation or you hear somebody say something and you think, I'd really like to have a more in-depth conversation or some kind of communication with that person, then you can kind of mention that on the connections area of the tabula. And it might be also ideas for future Power of the World conferences. Who knows, it might even be face-to-face, but what would you love to see this conference include perhaps next year or the year after? And then coming finally to the top right, you can see it says Atrium Day breakout room suggestions. So tomorrow, Wednesday, is a different day in terms of the conference program. It's rather than having the sessions with the keynote speakers and the parallel sessions that we're having on the other days, this is a more informal kind of networking day. We'll be kicking off around 2:15 and it'll be the opportunity to form some groups and discuss topics that you would like to discuss. So we're looking for suggestions of discussion topics that you might like to cover off during tomorrow. So I know that one of the suggestions we'd heard already was kind of about how to, bringing together people who are perhaps earlier in their research careers in these areas to perhaps discuss how do you thrive, how do you make a career in this very interdisciplinary area. Thanks, Scott. That's been really helpful. So please do take these opportunities to contribute to the conference in this way, whether that's through an open floor, through the chat, or through adding to the tabula. We would love to hear from you. Okay, so we're very excited that the first part of today is a sharing of the wonderful documentary film about the life of Flannery O'Connor. We're going to watch the film, have a short break, and then have a round table discussion. But I'm very pleased to introduce the film, we are joined by the film's producers, Mark Bosco and Elizabeth Kaufman, who are just going to say a little bit more about the story behind this film and how it was made. So Mark and Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cara, and it's good to be with everybody in Europe, especially here in the States. I'm Mark Bosco. I'm at Georgetown University, but I was for a very long time at Loyola University, where I got to meet my wonderful colleague, Elizabeth Kaufman. And so this film really kind of came out. I'm just going to talk a little bit at the beginning. I'm going to let Elizabeth take it away in these just 10 minutes introduction before the film. But it was really a love of kind of a labor of love, a love affair with Flannery O'Connor. We found ourselves inheritors of gifted with a bunch of documentaries that was done by a friend of ours named Christopher O'Hare in the late 90s, which was really kind of like the backbone of a Flannery O'Connor biography. And I came to Elizabeth, having done some work on Flannery O'Connor, I came to Elizabeth and said, listen, you're the documentarian, you teach it, you've got awards for it, can you help put this together? So I'm gonna just introduce you now, Elizabeth. She's still at Loyola Chicago. She's got the Flannery poster in the back. Maybe just tell a little story, the backstory of the film.
Certainly. Thanks a lot, Mark. And you brought the film project to me that helped us both win some awards, which when Mark, this was about a decade ago now, first came to me and said, hey, I'm having a conference in 2011 and I need someone to help me with some interviews. And I rolled my eyes a little bit and said, okay, sure. And then he said, oh, I have these videos, maybe we should make a documentary. Can you help me figure out how to do that? And again, I rolled my eyes. But when I looked at the wonderful footage that Mark had brought, that Chris O'Hare had donated to our project, we both knew that it had great potential with interviews with Sally Fitzgerald, Bob Giroux, close family and friends, that I knew this was a National Endowment for the Humanities project, and I was very hopeful that we could get on the PBS series American Masters. So, you know, almost a decade later, we achieved our goals, and after a lot of hard work and a great collaboration, I think we kind of found ourselves. But maybe this is the time to talk a little bit about our different backgrounds and our collaboration. I mean, Mark is the O'Connor scholar. I grew up an English major in the South, Protestant. I have a sister who is an ordained Presbyterian minister. I have another sister who is Catholic, who is married to Alan Tate's son, lives in England. And so our dining room family table was always full of religious discussion and literary discussion, and we were all about writing and performance and storytelling, as well as religious and philosophical tensions around story and the word. So, you know, the interests that I had are shared very much with Mark. Shares very similar interests, and I think in how we figured out and focused on the life story and the biography of Flannery O'Connor, and really diving into the research, reading all of her letters, reading, you know, I was not the scholar. I loved Faulkner and knew Faulkner, but I honestly did not know O'Connor's work that well. I certainly did not know her letters and her personal biography. I knew her fiction. So this project, getting connected to her theological instincts and really what personally drove her and kept her vital, it took years for me personally to figure out and for us together to think about how to thread that through the film. So I'm hopeful that it comes through. I mean, Mark, do you want to talk about being an O'Connor scholar?
Yeah, so I've always loved Flannery. I was the Catholic kid who heard that she was Catholic and said, no, there's no possible way. There's way too many dead people lying on the streets of her stories. How is she this Catholic writer? And but so that's my high school moment. But it continued to be a love affair with Flannery O'Connor, and especially, my interest is always how does faith produce culture, and so what are the cultural productions of faith, and I saw O'Connor as this amazing person who met her moment through this modernist context. So I always think of Flannery O'Connor as this kind of Catholic modernist. And I think Elizabeth and I really connected there, because I think Elizabeth also saw how she was using the short story, how she was using form and symbol, how she was very much steeped in that kind of mid-century literary kind of moment. But really, everything undergirding it really is this commitment to her vocation as a writer and as a Catholic writer, literally having to figure out how to do the work she wanted to do, and not lose herself to ego, to her ambition, tried to make it all, really, to use a Jesuit term, the greater glory of God. So it was really an interesting film, because we wanted to do biography, but we thought, because her stories are just drenched with a kind of Catholic kind of philosophical vision that everybody can embrace on some levels, but how do we tell stories? How do we tell her stories as well as her biography? And that was really one of the things that Elizabeth really helped on, because we didn't have a lot of opportunity to perform, act out, but we could do animation. So maybe Elizabeth, you might say a few words about that.
Certainly. And I guess the one thing I would add, Mark, about both of our backgrounds and our reaction to O'Connor and her work is, you're from St. Louis, I'm from just south of Savannah, Georgia, and the material, growing up in the places we both grew up in different ways. I mean, there was just no way to interact with faith, certainly where I was from, without interacting with race, without interacting with segregation, without being personally horrified at the apartheid that was going on around me. And coming from a situation where I immediately identified with what O'Connor in her work was trying to sort of process. And then, as we were making the film, and wanted from the very beginning, to include O'Connor's fiction in her personal biography. I mean, she, was a committed Catholic, went to mass every morning, and then she went home and wrote, and that was her life. So we needed some drama in there. And what did she write about? What did she, commit her life to really accomplishing? We really wanted to figure out how to do that. But Flannery O'Connor's trust forbid us from using actors to do dramatic reenactments. So we had to sort of work around that and got them to approve motion graphics and animation. So we hired 3 great female animators. O'Connor was a cartoonist, so it felt really appropriate to visualize and illustrate her work in the manner that she also did her own sort of cartoon work.
Yeah. So we just have just a minute or two, but it really was a collaboration. As all of you probably know, it's in some ways it's so much easier to write a book. You close the door and but one of the things I also loved is that I really went on a journey with Elizabeth, with her partner, and with so many other people. It was really a collaboration. And I have to say, I learned a lot about documentary filmmaking. Elizabeth always says I was a born producer. Maybe that's the Jesuit in me, but learning the craft and the technology that kind of supports film. I would say this film, it was a labor of love. It was a very expensive film. It took us a long time to do it because we had to raise money. We had full-time jobs as professors at the same time. But it really was. We hope that you'll really enjoy the film. And if I'm Elizabeth, I'll give Elizabeth the last word. But I think we both wanted to say, if you could watch this film for a national audience, would people want to go back to her stories? Would they fall in love with her in a little way, the way that we fell in love with her writing and with her life? Elizabeth, you want to have the last word before we go back to the film?
Well, certainly. I mean, from the music to the animation to her words and the hearing of her words in her biography, I certainly fell in love and became entranced again with how she was thinking about language, her faith, her challenges, and the challenges of the world around her, and how those things all came together, and hopefully they come together in the film.
Mark and Elizabeth, thank you for that wonderfully insightful and passionate introduction to the film. Scott, over to you if you'd like to start the film, please. Wow, I'm very grateful to have seen that. For those of you that haven't seen the message in chat, we're going to take a short break now before the roundtable discussion. So we'll be getting back together again at 1:15. So we'll see you then.
Incredible film. I feel hugely privileged to have seen it, and I'm even more delighted now to welcome back Mark. For those of you who might want to know a little bit more about Mark, apart from being a filmmaker, Mark is Vice President for the Mission and Ministry at Georgetown University, where he also holds an appointment in the English department. I'm delighted now to welcome Angela Alamo O'Donnell, who is Professor at Fordham University and a poet and a writer. And then finally, and by no means least, Michael Murphy, who is the Director of the Hanks Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage at Loyola University in Chicago. And we're delighted to invite Angela, Mark and Michael to, I think, discuss now Flannery, A Literary Journey to the Province of Joy. You're going to hear their reflections and some poems by Angela, and then we're going to welcome your questions, because I'm sure you're going to have questions following the film. So over to you. I think, is it Angela who's starting? Over to you, Angela.
Yes, I am starting. Thank you so much, Liz, for that introduction. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable discussion of Flannery O'Connor, The Journey to the Province of Joy. I'm delighted to join my colleagues, Mark Bosco and Michael Murphy, for this conversation about Father Bosco's new documentary and Elizabeth Kaufman's new documentary, and more broadly, the life and work of Flannery O'Connor. Before I continue, I just want to make sure, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, great. Let me see if I can get my text up here so I can look at you while I speak. 1 second. Oh, Zoom, we love you. Okay. Father Bosco will offer the first presentation, a summation of the film, an account of its origins, and what it offers to O'Connor's scholars, readers, and fans. Mark's paper addresses the reputation of the mature, wholly formed person and writer, Flannery O'Connor. The second paper by Michael Murphy focuses on and digs a bit deeper into Flannery O'Connor's formation as a Catholic artist and addresses her influences as both an apprentice writer and her formation as a reader. Mike pays particular attention to her theological interlocutors. Third and last, my paper moves further back into O'Connor's past and formation, focusing on her childhood to see the glimmers of the deeply faithful Catholic artist Flannery O'Connor would eventually become. With each presentation, our panel moves backwards and inwards, trying to get to the heart of who Flannery O'Connor was as a writer, as a Catholic, and as a human being. So I'm going to start our conversation, our unconventional conversation, in an unconventional way with a poem. I'm the author of a biography of Flannery O'Connor, Fiction Fired by Faith, and I'm also the author of a book of 101 poems that channel the voice of Flannery O'Connor, called Andalusian Hours. As a result of spending a decade or so writing about O'Connor and several decades reading and teaching her work, like many of us here, O'Connor's voice has been in my head for quite a long time. I wrote the poems as a means of establishing a kind of imaginative conversation that we can have with her, of entering into her mind, seeing the world through her eyes, and trying to articulate her thoughts. The poems are the fruit and substance of that conversation. The collection also serves as a kind of second biography of O'Connor, as the book's narrative arc traces the progress of her life from her childhood in Savannah to her death at the age of 39 on Andalusia Farm. The poems offer an account of her interior life rather than the exterior one, her imaginative engagement with the world rather than a purely physical one. So our roundtable conversation today will offer both a scholarly and a poetic exploration of the life and work of our fellow Catholic writer, Flannery O'Connor. We'll be interspersing poems throughout our presentations today, moving from verse to prose and prose to verse to provide both perspectives on Flannery. And so I'll begin with this poem that addresses the theme of our presentation today. Flannery considers her vocation. And the poem has an epigraph. All of the poems have an epigraph from O'Connor's own writing, and that is really the generative spark for the poem. And this one is a statement O'Connor makes where she says, "The moral basis of poetry is the accurate naming of the things of God." And so I spend my days playing Adam, not Eve, though like her, I see the world with eyes open, worms in the apple, snakes in the trees, the miseries that unfurl themselves against the blue paradise of sky. No stranger to the daily pains and aches that make us human and fallen, a damn sight less lovely than we once were. We die, Horatio. That's the tragic fact of the life we're given and the life I paint. There's no perfection. There's no pure act that can save us. Even poetry ain't redemption. Still, I choose to waste my days with lost Eve and Adam, naming his praise. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Mark Bosco.
Thanks, Angela. Angela gave some of these poems for the first time, and as they were being done at a conference we did on Flannery O'Connor in Seville, Spain. So it's nice to see that it moved from there to really a warm reception. So I'm glad that we could bring some of those in. So really what I want to do today is, you've seen the film. I just want to talk about some of the people that are in the film, what they've said, and some of the ways in which it's been received. I love that quote from Alice McDermott. She says, "Flannery O'Connor is unique. There is no one like her. You can't lump her with Faulkner. You can't lump her with Walker Percy. You can't lump her with anyone." And by proclaiming this, and of course, Alice McDermott is herself a writer whose own Catholic imagination is fully on display in her novels, she kind of places O'Connor in the canon of American literature. And it echoes a lot of the novelists and the artists and the literary critics who were asked the same questions in our film. And as you saw, we were trying to do, as Elizabeth and I said, it's part biography and part an exploration of some of O'Connor's stories. And we were just trying to glimpse and have people see a little bit of this remarkable woman. So Elizabeth and I, and so many of the collaborators, we really did this. It was an 8 to 10 year project overall, but we wanted to make sure that we could do both things at the same time, that we could converge 4 maybe aspects of her life that seemed to be resonating with us today. So Flannery O'Connor in terms of faith, Flannery O'Connor in terms of race, Flannery O'Connor in terms of gender, and then finally Flannery O'Connor in disability. So hopefully, as you saw the film, O'Connor was a devout and intellectually formed Roman Catholic. She was also a person of white privilege during the dismantling of the Jim Crow South. She was a serious fiction writer in a predominantly male world of writers and publishers. And she was a person challenged by her autoimmune disease, lupus. So our film tries to place her in that kind of amidst those aspects, but also the social changes right after World War II, and trying to portray basically a nation that was haunted by religious belief in her time, and I think is still very much haunted by religious belief today. As we said before, much of this came from the early film interviews that Chris O'Hare did in the late 1990s with Sally Fitzgerald and others. And really, it was his experience of being a Harvard undergrad who then goes to Mass at St. Paul's in Cambridge and meets Sally Fitzgerald and says, "Listen, anybody from Harvard who wants to come over to my table for lunch once a month, I'm going to do a Flannery O'Connor seminar." So he was one of those early freshmen and that's how he fell in love with her. And so many people actually at Harvard have an affection for Flannery O'Connor. You saw Tommy Lee Jones. Tommy Lee Jones did his Harvard thesis on Flannery O'Connor. Conan O'Brien went to Harvard. He did his Harvard senior thesis on Flannery O'Connor. So there is this kind of like legacy going on there. And I think mostly because of the Robert and Sally Fitzgerald. As we said before, it wasn't until 2012 then we really began to realize our plan for a film. And really, it was putting together so many different biographical pieces with our stories. Really, the early footage that Chris gave us convinced many people to agree to be interviewed, not the least of whom was Sally Fitzgerald's son, Michael, the screenwriter and producer of John Huston's film adaptation of Wise Blood. He's also a godson of Flannery. So again, it's a small little world. She lived with the Fitzgeralds for a time in Connecticut, right? So we were traveling around the country. We interviewed artists and performers. You saw them: Alice Walker Jones, Tobias Wolff, Alice McDermott, Mary Carr. And we talked also with cultural critics such as Richard Rodriguez and the New Yorker columnist Hilton Als. And then we kind of used Brad Gooch and Angelo, who's with us today, as a kind of the two narrative voices telling the biography and pulling out things. One of the things that I think that Elizabeth and I noticed is that there were so many photos that we had not seen before. There's not a lot of photos of Flannery, but we got to see more than what's usually around. And this was all in the archives. I still think the biggest find was the Sterling notebook, though, which was the kind of standard issue for college students that described the words higher mathematics. And it was O'Connor's earliest attempt at a journal. And we knew that it existed because in O'Hare's interview, Sally Fitzgerald talks about higher mathematics, but no one had actually been privy to it by the time we got to the archive. And so it's just a mere 30 pages long. But I think it's important in regards to what this conference is about, because I think she called it the higher mathematics really to disguise, to keep her mother, Regina, from snooping around her journal. And yet I think the title also serves to highlight the metaphysical concerns of O'Connor's Catholic faith, and that really propels her stories. There's something metaphorically apt in the title, a sense of a higher mathematics and awareness of a higher purpose in the calculus of her desire to be an artist. She wanted the artist's life more than anything else, possibly even more than the vocation of family and romantic love. We have in the film that word, I have so much to do. I don't think it's in the film. One quote, she says, I have so much to do that it scares me. Can you imagine an 18-year-old writing that, wanting to be a writer, that she had a sense that she had so much to write? As to what kind of artist she would be, we have in the film that wonderful quote, today I am devoted to realism. I will become a realist. I must write a novel. But I really do think that that journal contains in nascent form the elements of her personality. So we even glimpse her struggles with arthritis in that journal. And this is probably the first time that the lupus that killed her father 3 years earlier was already kind of there under the guise of being diagnosed as arthritis. So in some ways, that was very haunting for Elizabeth and I to see at 18, she was already feeling some of the effects of the disease that would take her life at the age of 39. So we talked a little bit about in the film, we tried to talk, how do we talk about her Catholicism and how do we do it to a broad group that's just not Catholic, right? We wanted this film to be seen as a national broadcast in the United States and the world. And so we knew that obviously that she immersed herself in the currents of 20th century revival, and that she had touched upon and read Catholic philosophy and theology that I think both Mike and Angela might speak a little bit about. But there's that wonderful line she writes in a letter to Betty Hester. She says, I write the way I do because, not though, I am a Catholic. However, I am a Catholic peculiarly possessed of the modern consciousness, that thing Jung describes as unhistorical, solitary, and guilty. So all these critics and artists that we interviewed for the film spoke of O'Connor's faith as an essential component that shaped her fiction. But we were grappling with how to visually narrate the intellectual ferment of Catholicism and its larger historical moment in modern American life. And it was the Canadian novelist and literary critic Randy Boyagoda who helped me in his responses to suggest how we might look at the horrors of the 20th century as a way to understand the revival of Catholic philosophy and theology. Here, a generation of writers who came of age during the rise of totalitarian regimes, world wars, and the terror of the Jewish and atomic holocausts question the purpose of humanity as never before, looking for a higher order account of human purpose. And Randy notes that O'Connor's Catholicism, quote, peculiarly possessed of the modern consciousness, blended the truths of medieval metaphysics with modern existential categories. So her Catholicism became an asset for her in assessing the crisis of modernity and a way for her to re-articulate the transcendent call to human flourishing. Her Southern Gothic vision was informed by the Catholic cultural moment of that time. As O'Connor herself notes to Betty Hester, to possess this sense of crisis within the church is to bear a burden, the necessary burden of the conscious Catholic. It's to feel the contemporary situation at the ultimate level. So we do feel like by exploring her short stories, we tried to get the existential sensibility of these modern parables through the Temple of the Holy Ghost, A Good Man is Hard to Find in her novel. Two last things. And as to race and Southern manners, I hope you saw that we didn't hide the fact that O'Connor used the N-word in her banter with her friends, and that in some ways we're dealing with race and a kind of the dismantling of a very systemic Jim Crow South. And for me, at least, it was the interview with the critic Bruce Gentry, who was a professor at O'Connor's alma mater, the Georgia State College in Milledgeville, who really helped us to find a way to understand the way race operates in her life and work. There's other things, but I just really love this comment. And we don't have it quite in the film, but we have some of it. He comments that O'Connor is the best American fiction writer for recovering racists, for people learning not to be racist, implying that anyone who unconsciously lives within the categories of white privilege are in fact always recovering from the latent effects of that racism. Gentry says in the film, recovering from white racism takes a long time. I kind of said it like he does in the film. And O'Connor would have included herself in that recovery. Indeed, her stories are shocking and revolutionary in the ways they bring home to her readers the assumptions of whiteness. Her characters are caught up short by their deformed understanding of status and race. So a couple things, we didn't, some of it is in the film, as we said, Alice McDermott notes that O'Connor's gift is sui generis. There hasn't been anyone like her before or anybody like her since in American fiction, she observes. Tobias Wolff from Stanford says, when he discusses O'Connor's work with his MFA students, he encourages them to wrestle with O'Connor's brilliance, not in order to imitate her, but rather to see the emotional impact that fiction can produce. One of the lines that he said to me was, quote, one needs to go through Flannery O'Connor, not around her, he says. Or as O'Connor's editor, Robert Giroux, simply exclaimed in one of O'Hare's interviews, she was a genius. So finally, I would just like to say that with the film being produced, Elizabeth and I were keenly aware of Black Lives Matter, starting that movement, and really the systemic racism of our country of the last couple of years, last summer especially. And we were just hoping that we've come to Flannery O'Connor in a new space, realizing that, what she was writing about, those universal things, are still very much part of our life today. I think O'Connor draws us into the mysterious gray, the gray area of modern life, where the brokenness of the human condition plays out in these dramas of violence and redemption. As Gordon says in the film, Flannery O'Connor is one of the few writers who is not afraid to look into the darkness. The darkness, what O'Connor might call the burden of original sin, haunts her and haunts us in reading her. O'Connor's stories are redemptive acts because they send us, the readers, to look inside ourselves where something in us as storytellers and listeners demands a redemptive act, that demands that what falls at least shall be offered the chance to be restored. And finally, quickly, if you'll indulge me, I want to share my 5 top anecdotes, people who have seen the film and wanted to talk to me afterward. They all spoke about how Flannery's writing helped them. Number 1, a man came up to me after seeing it and said that he had hit rock bottom with alcohol abuse, and that his AA sponsor gave him a copy of The Habit of Being, the collection of her letters, and it was the single most important thing he reads besides the Bible. I was like, wow. 2, a professor in Michigan told me that he keeps The Habit of Being by his bed and reads 5 to 10 letters from it every night. When he finishes the 800 pages of letters, he begins again. He is on his 10th round and his wife thinks he's crazy. The third one, A woman producer told me that her mother had died quite suddenly, and that when she went to her mother's apartment, O'Connor's short stories were on the side table near her mother's bed. She decided to take the book home and read the stories. She said those stories helped her channel her grief. Fourth, a college student came up to me and said that he had turned away from the church and that this past year he read the short stories of Flannery O'Connor and he had a strange conversion experience and now attends Mass. And finally, a young woman writer came up to me after this and said that as she came out of the closet as lesbian, it was the stories and the letters of Flannery O'Connor that helped her find her intellectual and literary feet. So those are kinds of the ways in which this vocation of writer that Flannery has done has really affected other people. Thank you very much. I think it goes back to Angela.
Thank you, Mark. I love this comment that Mark made, and many of the comments he made, of course, but one of them about O'Connor's stories being redemptive acts. And I think at one point that was going to be the subtitle for the film, if I remember correctly, redemptive acts. Yeah. So I thought I would read a poem that to segue into Michael's paper that addresses O'Connor's own sense of her fiction as being a redemptive act. And this poem is called Flannery's Trick. The quotation is from The Habit of Being, in which Flannery says, "My mother and I live in the country a few miles outside of Milledgeville. The place is a dairy farm, and I am glad to say that most of the violences carried to their logical conclusion in the stories manage to be warded off, in fact, here, though most of them exist in potentiality." This is Flannery's trick. And it's my stories that save us from the ravages of not so good country people who will steal your fake leg out from under you, marry your daughter just to get your car and abandon her pretty pink head, who will set your woods on fire for fun, kill your family one by one, and leave you on the side of the road, much the worse for wear. I couldn't bear to just sit there, let evil have its way with me and mine. So I rise each day and write down horrors I pray don't come true. To fend off the devil, you give him his due. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Murphy, who is going to present some thoughts about O'Connor. His paper is entitled That Which Pleases Upon Being Seen, Flannery O'Connor and the Joy of Reading.
Wow, thank you, Angela. I really appreciate your poetry. I'm going to snap in appreciation. And really, Mark, Angela, great to see you again, my two good friends. And want to thank you. It's a delight to be with both of you today on this panel. And I'm also glad to see Elizabeth Kaufman on this call. That's wonderful as well. So with that, thanks. I want to thank the organizers of the conference for the opportunity and the invitation to speak. So my remarks are, I'm calling That Which Pleases Upon Being Seen, Flannery O'Connor and the Joy of Reading. And so readers of Flannery O'Connor are well aware of her experience in the MFA program at the prestigious Iowa Writers Workshop from 1945 to 1947. But Iowa as an incubating space for her faith life as a writer is a topic not too often broached in O'Connor's studies. Of course, Mark and Elizabeth know well the shape of O'Connor's religious commitments, and they navigate them, I think, perfectly in the film, especially given the demography of their target kind of public television audience, to be kind of, shorthand that one. They know as well as anyone that O'Connor's is an innovative theological aesthetics of the late modern kind. But to amplify these connections more fully in the film than they do would likely result in a much different experience and attract a more specialized audience. One like this, perhaps. So let's click on Flannery as a theologian a bit more and see what we find out. As we see in the film, to encounter the voice of O'Connor in a prayer journal from 2013, published in 2013, is to behold a soul in its nascent desire to serve God precisely through artistic vocation. O'Connor's self-conscious formation in what she called aesthetic craftsmanship, a kind of precursor to what today might be termed the Catholic imagination, where craft and content combine in a unique way, was developed decisively and transformed in Iowa. A precocious and promising student arrives from Milledgeville as Mary F. O'Connor. She departs Iowa City after her post-MFA year in 1948 as Flannery O'Connor, a writer with a mission. Take me, dear Lord, and set me in the direction I'm going to go. My Lady of Perpetual Help, pray for me, writes Flannery in her journal. Her prayer journal itself is a rather slim volume, consisting of 20-odd entries, best described as a prayer dialogue with God. The first part is characterized by the high romance of an earnest soul seeking to offer up her artistic gifts in divine service. In the tradition of so much religious and spiritual autobiography, O'Connor makes this desire foundational by shaping her first entries, written in pencil, as petitions and endowing them with the kind of rhetorical bluster that would make most any high church orator proud. Quote, "Dear God, I cannot love thee the way I want to." And quote, "Dear God, tonight is not disappointing because you have given me the story. Don't ever let me think that I was anything but the instrument for your story." Still, even with its patina of performed piety and the air of sentimentality, such entries are both endearing and revelatory and make way for later reflections written in pen that disclose, as the months unravel, a more self-possessed and theologically mature pilgrim. Diary reflections that naturally reveal the O'Connor we have come to know. In Iowa, and for the first time in her life, reading became a sustained activity. This might surprise you for O'Connor. I know many of us recall fondly those years in our lives when we were reading in the open spaces of time, following our own lights, along with the kind direction of beloved mentors. So the second half of the journal is a series of reactions inspired not only by her reading of various literary and critical works on her graduate syllabi, but so too other less fashionable but seminally Catholic texts. As O'Connor muses, this extracurricular reading was not entirely countercultural as, quote, "Even among the literary now, it is becoming popular to believe in God. There is a certain something shocking about it." But clearly, there is a sea change in O'Connor's intellectual and spiritual life at this time. There are, of course, references to literary masters such as Kafka, Lawrence, James, and Proust, but also references to St. Thomas, Peggy, Blois, and Bernanos, writers who inspired the 20th century Catholic literary revival and who would begin to occupy her interest with acute profundity. While the importance of Hawthorne or Chekhov or Poe, whom she loved from her youth, to the development of O'Connor's aesthetic craft work cannot be overstated. It is Léon Blois who occupies perhaps a special space in the development of her fledgling Catholic imagination and the stakes that come with that. It was Blois who instructed Jacques and Raissa Maritain and Raissa's sister Vera in Catholic thought and spirituality. It was Blois who critically intervened in the life of the Maritains, Blois who was their godfather. It is fair to say that Jacques Maritain and his heart-solid neo-Thomism is essential in any discussion about O'Connor's thought and work, and there is no Jacques Maritain without Léon Blois. Even the great Bernanos says of Blois, "I owe him everything." In a prayer journal, Blois teaches O'Connor not only the heart of Christianity, that, quote, "to scoff at the poor person is to trample on the heart of Jesus Christ," but also insights about refining her narrative art. O'Connor writes, "These modern Christs pictured on war posters and in poems, 'Every man is a Jesus, every woman Mary,' would have made Blois wretch. The rest of us have lost the power to vomit." A kind of approach to characterization and narrative psychology that will serve later as a subtext of so many O'Connor stories and put to rest any childish retreats into sentimentality once and for all. To dialogue with essential thinkers like Blois and other great crossover figures like Newman, William James, Gilson, Marcel, Monnier, so many others, was essential expeditionary work for O'Connor. And these forays helped her become the kind of artist and thinker that she wanted to be. She was out to cultivate what the American Jesuit literary scholar William Lynch called a fiction of theological creativity. And her wide reading in theology, philosophy, psychology, and well beyond became what Sally Fitzgerald distilled as a habit of being, the positively Thomistic title of the collection of O'Connor letters edited by Fitzgerald and published in 1979. And let me just note here, like Mark was just saying, I've had I have an inordinate love for the habit of being, like so many. I've had those letters on my bedside table for 30 years, and I read them over and over. It's like the Gospels. I find something new every time. In fact, my second copy is in my office at Loyola, and I couldn't get it because of COVID, so I had to buy a new one. So anyway, it's amazing. But to return to crafting fiction, the fiction of theological creativity, far from employing a formulaic rubrical approach, where the artist condescends to both reader and the art by artificially shoehorning high ideas into short stories prescriptively, O'Connor's approach to writing works from the ground up. It is a theological aesthetics where idea and form and mystery are set free to interpenetrate one another in the fecundating dynamism of the artistic space. O'Connor's project, in short, is the literature of Christian realism, replete with an innovative structural discipline and a whole slew of what she fondly called gracious catastrophes. 10 years or so after Iowa, O'Connor began to write another journal of sorts, book reviews for the Bulletin, her diocesan newspaper. The comedic asymmetry of this relationship notwithstanding, the reviews tell us so much about the thought traffic moving through O'Connor's mind the last years of her life. Leo Zuber's collection of these book reviews, The Presence of Grace and Other Book Reviews, published in 1983, is like a prayer journal and higher mathematics, and of course, The Habit of Being, especially enlightening and essential reading. We see another expression of aesthetic craftsmanship alive in her pithy and powerful reviews, and the master's toolbox migrates across the terrain of all her writing, her fiction, letters, essays, and occasional prose. These reviews show us a kind of language engineering that is singular in its laser-sharp brevity. Sentences so perfect that they evaporate against the phenomena that they so perceptively and vividly disclose. O'Connor praises a book by Granville Hicks in 1957 for the power of verbal economy. Here's a quote. Having the most to say, she says it in the fewest words, which greatly intensifies its impact. This is an insight that obviously clues us in decidedly to her compositional philosophy. When O'Connor brings her critical blade more sharply, this time in 1963, she does so in the same exacting spirit. O'Connor decries, quote, jargon, held dear in educational circles. The rule is, if one word will do, use four. Thus, experience becomes experiential contact with reality. Bastard words are either borrowed or invented. Example, educand. An educand is presumably the victim of an educator. A boneyard of dead or abstract or unnecessary phrases is thrown up between the reader and the thought. Wow, mea culpa. Oops, that was a note to self. But mea culpa indeed, I'm guilty of that one. These reviews are noteworthy because they are mostly concerned with books in theology. Reviews of books by Carl Adam, Gustav Weigel, Victor White, Henri de Lubac, Karl Barth, Yves Congar, just to name a few, fill the pages of George's Bulletin. Add these names to the ones we find in Flannery O'Connor's personal library, compiled by Arthur Kinney and set in his excellent text, Flannery O'Connor's Library, Resources of Being, in 1985. And we see more fully how important her readings in theology were to her. As Kinney's book discloses, there are 56 pages of titles in theology and religion. Second place goes to literature, novels mainly, with 38 pages of entries. As I close, I offer an observation, one that speaks again to vision and to craft. It's not as if O'Connor reads Louis Bouillet on consecration and then writes Greenleaf, or that she reads Teilhard on Christogenesis and then writes Everything That Rises Must Converge, or that she reads Romano Guardini, a favorite of Pope Francis's and hers, 6 reviews in Zuber of Guardini by O'Connor. It's not as if she reads Guardini and then writes about the turgid effects of sentimentality that fills her fiction. But so too, no person stands alone. What we read, who we read, matters. You know, it was so lovely to hear David Lonsdale reflect yesterday in this vein. I just hopped on the call a little bit later, right when David said this. And David said that, to the effect that the call of literature is first the call to read. I mean, it's amazing. I remember that movie, the Attenborough movie, C.S. Lewis, that line, "We read to know we're not alone." It's beautiful. For my part, it is most interesting to note the conversation partners that helped O'Connor convey the complexity of theological phenomena in her fiction without descending to cheap reductionism or proof texting on the one hand, and without thwarting or limiting their radiance on the other. To me, this is the chief virtue of her craftsmanship, and it becomes, for me, following Maritain and O'Connor, a province of joy. I'm grateful to be in conversation with this community about these topics, for this too is a joy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful reflection on O'Connor's reading. I want, by the way, to jump on the habit of being bandwagon. Speaking of the joy of reading, this is my 3rd copy, and I bought this book at Midway Books in St. Paul. Those of you who are from St. Paul know it's a fantastic used bookstore. And one of the reasons I fell in love with this particular copy, in addition to it being a hardcover, is the inscription on it. It was owned by a woman who received it as a Mother's Day gift. The inscription says, "To Mom on Mother's Day, 1980, to another great letter writer, Flannery, for your bedstand." And it's signed Jeff. And so when I first read this copy and I got to the very last letter, there's a note from his mother, and it says, "So rich, so deep, so human. I'm glad to know you, Flannery." So there's this beautiful little story encapsulated in this used book, and I treasure it for that reason. There are so many poems that come to mind for me to read in response to Michael's wonderful paper, but because he mentioned Poe, I'm going to read one about Poe. And this is called Flannery and Poe. And she says, in A Habit of Being, "I read the best Southern writers, read the Russians, have learned something from Hawthorne, Flaubert, Balzac, and something from Kafka. I've read almost all of Henry James, but always the largest thing that looms up is the humorous tales of Edgar Allan Poe. I am sure he wrote them all while drunk, too." And this is the poem of Flannery and Poe. "My favorite one about the man too vain to wear his glasses and married his granny by mistake. That was good fiction to my young mind. In what world other than Poe's would the madmen take over and run the asylum more sanely than the sane? Misery that he was, he had an eye for the ridiculous, which suited me just fine. We both shared a good nose for the macabre, which odors all our days. I come not to bury, but to praise his dark art, this black literary rose who perfumes my work with his strange scent, teaching me his sober merriment." So a little reflection on Flannery's reading. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Mark, and thank you to everyone who organized this conference and who's here today. What a delightful conversation to be a part of. So I'm going to add my piece, going a little bit further back into Flannery's childhood. And this is called One Writer's Beginnings, Portrait of an Artist as a Young Child. Let me just bring up my text here. Sorry, failed to do that earlier. There we go. As is evident in the famous chicken episode in Flannery O'Connor's life, featured in the Flannery documentary, she knew even as a child that she had talents that made her unique, and that she was determined to be famous on account of them. She may not have known the precise form of expression her artistic talents would take at the age of 5, but she somehow understood that she had an angle of vision that was different from that of her parents, of her teachers, and of the children that she went to school with. She also knew, as Michael has discussed in his paper, that somehow her faith and her art were inextricably bound up with each other. As Sally Fitzgerald states movingly at the end of the documentary, Flannery considered her talent a gift. She considered her faith a gift, and she wanted to return them with gain. Like the faithful steward entrusted with his master's talent, O'Connor would invest all of her energy and ingenuity in becoming the artist she was meant to be, and this way give glory to God. Even in her earliest years, we can see the seeds of O'Connor's mature theological and aesthetic vision in her work. First, the grotesque. We know that young Flannery had an eye for oddity, a taste for strangeness, and an interest in the aberrant. Among the chickens she collected, she had a fondness for birds with freakish characteristics, those with mismatched eyes and disproportionate limbs, and she searched in vain for those with extra legs and wings. This early focus on so-called freaks is portentous. In the stories she would write as an adult, O'Connor would regularly write about people who were different, who did not fit in, often on account of some sort of physical deformity or limitation. Her fiction presents the reader with a parade of afflicted characters, all of whose difference places them outside the norm. Flannery describes her affection for such people in this poem from Andalusian Hours. She speaks about her characters at a time in her career when she is experiencing writer's block, and this is called Flannery Deserted. She says in her letter written to a friend, "Pray that the Lord will send me some more stories. I've been writing for 16 years, and I have the sense of having exhausted my original potential and being now in need of the kind of grace that deepens perception, a new shot of life, or something." Flannery Deserted. I did not think I would ever grow tired of them, my entourage of oddballs, my communion of sinners, my flagship of folks and freaks. They have stuck with me through my darkest days and longest nights, shown kinship when I was lonely, when all I knew was pain and certainty I wouldn't amount to nothing. They fired my faith in the impossible and made me a disciple of delight, held hooch to my lip and made me sip from the jug till I was light-headed with laughter. No, sir, I never believed the time would come when they would leave. Flannery felt a kinship with freaks because she regarded herself as one of them, a person who did not comfortably fit into any conventional culture she was expected to belong to. This included her community, this included school, and this also included the church to some extent. This inherent sympathy with brokenness represents the stirrings of a theological understanding that lies at the foundation of Christianity, as well as serving as the foundation of all of her fiction. That frailty is the common condition of being human, a condition that was taken on and redeemed by the God of the universe through the incarnation. Flannery's childhood disposition is a harbinger of one of O'Connor's signature qualities as a writer, her affection for the grotesque. Plot after plot in her stories enact the universal grotesquerie of human nature and the universal need for grace. In Flannery's Juvenilia, located in the archives of Emory University, we see again and again in her drawings and poems her sense of delight in the oddness of human beings, her concern about ultimate and theological issues such as mortality, the last judgment, and the afterlife, and her unrelenting sense of humor, even when dealing with these serious concerns. As an example, I'd like to screen share this book that she wrote for her father, giving him advice on how to live a virtuous life. And I'm hoping that this is going to work. Can everyone see that? Everyone see it? Okay, great. So this is a card that Flannery made for her dad, and it's called How to Live to be 80 and Still Get to Heaven. It's all written in verse, as you'll see. Flannery thought that, she said once, that poetry was a filthy habit for a fiction writer to get into, but obviously she wrote some poetry as a child. She says, if you want to live a life of righteousness and gain, just follow these directions here, and you will catch the heaven-bound train. Avoid, and I love this page because she's got, devil faces and liquor and cursing down there, damn it. But she also has soap, since she didn't like taking a bath. So again, mixing the ridiculous here with the sublime, the ultimate with the everyday. She writes, liquor is a rotten drug, and those who drink it know that if this habit's once begun, you're sure to go below. And I also love her little concrete poem of below there, stepping the person downward towards hell. Tobacco is a stupid plant, and those who chew it say that if this habit's once begun, you're sure to rue the day. She spells sure, S-H-U-R. Flannery maintained for the rest of her life that she was what she called an innocent speller. Cussing is a right bad habit, and those who do it tell that if the habit's once begun, you're headed straight for. And I love, of course, that we all know that the rhyme has got to be hell, but she doesn't want to write it and endanger her immortal soul, so she just puts the blank there. Some say that if you want to go to heaven and to choose the narrow path, that every Saturday afternoon, you gotta take a bath. And then she says, personally, I think that's a lot of baloney. So again, mixing this desire for heaven and this desire for immortality with her ridiculous everyday concerns as part of her humor, and she knows it. She knows that there's a quality of the grotesque, the high and the low that she's mixing here. And then her last page is, amen. Oh, be kind, P.S., be kind to the little woman. Amen. And I love that she ends this just as she would end a prayer, good Catholic girl that she is, with amen, because this is the prayer that she has for her father. Again, a very simple little card, one of many that you can find in the collection, and demonstrating to us O'Connor's concern, even at a very young age, with the immortal and with the everyday. We also learn from the documentary that Flannery was a gifted cartoonist. Her love of drawing pictures extended into her young adulthood, only instead of drawing chickens and ducks, she drew human beings, most often in situations that featured their foibles. As Flannery grew, however, she fell in love with writing as well. One of her favorite ways of practicing her craft took the form of letter writing. In the journal that Mark spoke about earlier, that she titled Higher Mathematics so cleverly, she writes with great confidence in her skill as a letter writer. And this poem, called Flannery's Talent, was inspired by this quotation from Flannery's Higher Mathematics, in which she writes, "My epistolary powers enthrall me. It is a pity I can't receive my own letters. If they provide as much wholehearted approval at their destination as they do at their source, they should indeed be able to keep my memory alive." Flannery's Talent. I always did want to be famous, ever since my chicken raising days. I knew myself to be special, the kind of child parents of other children shielded them from, as if it was catching, me being an oddball and all. Soon I saw that foul would not be my means to fame. Quick as I was, I knew I had to find my buried talent, my true vocation, when to my surprise, it found me. The letters I wrote to my ma and pa proved to be no mere childhood game. If St. Paul could do it, why not me? My epistles will go down in history. And of course, she's right about that. We all have our copies of The Habit of Being. O'Connor was prescient in predicting that her letters would contribute to her fame. The Habit of Being serves as a kind of autobiography, as well as a species of literary criticism in which she reflects so tellingly on her own life and work. Eventually, though, O'Connor would find fiction to be her most important talent. All of the work she did up until she began writing stories as a child and young adult was a preparation for this. She was engaging her imagination, looking hard at the world and at the people around her, and trying to fathom their mystery and make it available for others to see. At the heart of O'Connor's vision as both a child and an adult is what David Tracy has famously called the analogical imagination, a Catholic understanding that the creation is good, that an invisible divinity pervades the visible world, and that art is a means of revealing this vision to those who might not otherwise see it. In her story, A Temple of the Holy Ghost, discussed at some length in the film, O'Connor offers what is in some ways an autobiographical account of her own developing awareness of God's presence in the broken world. The unnamed little girl in the story is clearly a version of young Flannery. When her two cousins come to visit for the weekend, students at the local convent school, the 12-year-old protagonist watches them with fascination and with suspicion. They arrive calling each other Temple 1 and Temple 2, a joking reference to advice an elderly nun had given her young charges. When boys attempt to make sexual advances, good Catholic girls ought to respond, "Stop, sir, I am a temple of the Holy Ghost." The girls laugh hysterically at this, but the child does not find it funny at all. "I am a temple of the Holy Ghost," she said to herself, and was pleased with the phrase. It made her feel as if somebody had given her a present. Clearly, the child is oriented toward goodness, yet she is also perverse. Though steeped in religion, she recognizes her sinful nature and her seeming inability to curb it. Quote, "She didn't steal or murder, but she was a born liar and slothful, and she sassed her mother and was deliberately ugly to almost everybody. She was also eaten up with the sin of pride, the worst one." Like many Catholic children, the child longs to be a saint, but pondering this one night before falling asleep, she feels her unworthiness. Quote, "She could never be a saint, but she thought she could be a martyr if they killed her quick." It is difficult for her to know how much she'd be willing to endure for her faith, but she does know that redemptive suffering is part of the economy of salvation that she is participating in. The humor in this portrait is evident. O'Connor knows this child from the inside. As the story continues, we also learn that the child shares O'Connor's fascination with so-called freaks. When her cousins return from the fair, they tell the shocking story of the intersex person. The young girl wonders at this, but she wonders even more at the message the so-called freak delivers to the spellbound audience. Quote, "God made me this way. This is the way he wanted me to be, and I ain't disputing his way." In an intuitive theological leap, the child comes face to face with the mystery of the incarnation, God's unconditional love for his creatures, even in our radical imperfection. She recognized in the intersex person's public testament of faith an echo of the idea of being a temple of the Holy Ghost. The story depicts the child's conversion, a new orientation towards holiness, precipitated by this virtual encounter. In the final movement of the story, she accompanies her cousins along with her mother on their return to the convent, kneeling down in the chapel with the students and the nuns, bowing before the monstrance containing the host. Quote, "Her ugly thoughts stopped, and she began to realize that she was in the presence of God." The child recognizes the real presence and responds with a humility and gratitude we have not yet seen. She is also granted a new vision. As they drive away from the convent towards home, she sees the sun, quote, "a huge red ball, like an elevated host drenched in blood. And when it sank out of sight, it left a line in the sky like a red clay road hanging over the trees." This description, by the way, is preternaturally a reminder of the end of Revelation with that low swinging bridge up to the sky that all the souls are rumbling up towards heaven on. This early story obviously predates the late and last one. Playing on the trope of the Son, S-U-N, as Son of God, S-O-N, O'Connor depicts the child's new understanding of the seemingly ordinary world as visionary, as charged with the grandeur of God, as Hopkins says, as immanent with divine presence. This brings me to the final quality of O'Connor's theology and aesthetics that is evident in Flannery as a child. Her instinctive understanding that the universe, seen from a Judeo-Christian and particularly Catholic vantage point, is essentially comic. Human history doesn't end with the crucifixion, rather it begins anew with the incarnation and the resurrection. This helps also to explain Flannery's love of the grotesque, the blending of the horrific and the hilarious in her stories, because at the end of the day, the Christian knows that all shall be well. Her sense of humor is a sign of her certainty. As O'Connor once stated, "Only if you are secure in your beliefs can you see the comical side of the universe." It is no linguistic accident that the words human, humor, and humility all have the same root, the Indo-European hume, best translated by the English humus. Humus is a word meaning soil or earth, reminding us of the creation of Adam in Genesis, of the fact that human beings are made of the stuff of earth, and of our inevitable return to that earth. For dust we are, and to dust we shall return. The word human is derived from humus, returning us to the ground of our being etymologically, in much the same way death does physically. Thus, the very name used to describe man and womankind inevitably engenders in us humility, for what fool could be proud or arrogant in the face of such a humble beginning and a humble end? The word humor partakes of both our humanness and our humility, and that it thrives on the recognition of our flaws as fallen human beings. Humility allows us to admit and embrace our radical imperfection, and humor lets us delight in it. Humor and the comic are signals of transcendence. As theologian Jürgen Moltmann writes in The Coming of God, quote, "The laughter of the universe is God's delight. It is the universal Easter laughter." Humor, along with its attendant laughter, allows us to suspend the rules of the ordinary world, as it takes us out of ourselves and our current situation, dire as it may be, and enables us to glimpse a consoling vision that delights. The humor may be momentary, but this other reality that the humor points to is not temporary at all. It in fact highlights a world beyond our current troubles that is essentially comic. All things are possible with God. This is the redeeming power of laughter, which makes suffering easy to bear, in part because we know that this world is not the final conclusion. In some senses, humor acknowledges a sacramental universe, a visible sign of the invisible reality of God's presence. In keeping with this generous theology, it might be argued that God gives us the gift of laughter, that we may enjoy a foretaste of heaven. So these are the key ways that O'Connor aspired and journeyed towards the province of joy, through her comic vision, the exercise of her analogical imagination, and the daily habit of embodying her vision of the world through her art, all of which brought Flannery a kind of joy that was life-giving, both to herself and to all of us who read her. And so it seems fitting to conclude my remarks with one final poem, this one a brief meditation on Flannery's view of the necessity of comedy. The epigraph to this poem is one I quoted just earlier, a line I just quoted, where she says, "Only if we are secure in our beliefs can we see the comical side of the universe." This is called Flannery's Laugh. Or so I tell myself my darkest days, when rain falls hard and when wind howls loud enough to scare me into thought. I stay sane by looking slantwise instead of straight. Expert at the odd angle, I know the devil looks absurd without his pants, just like the rest of us. I can't hate what I can mock, can't cry when I'm laughing at the fool's world we've lucked into living in. Besides, there's nowhere else to go. As a child, I made my daddy proud with my wacky stories. My proper aunts worried there was something wrong with me, not knowing we are all saved by comedy. Thank you.
Angela, Mark and Michael, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts on Flannery's journey to the province of joy. I don't think, sadly, we have enough time for questions, which is a real shame. So what I suggest is if anybody does have any questions for Mark, Angela and Michael, and for Elizabeth, if you'd like to put them in chat, I'm hoping that Mark, Angela, Michael and Elizabeth might pick those up in chat and answer them in chat. I'm conscious that time is moving on and that we really do need now to move into our parallel sessions. But a huge, huge thank you to Elizabeth and Mark for the film, and then Mark, Angela and Michael sharing your thoughts and reflections following that on Flannery's literary journey. So I am now going to turn the tables now to all of you as we move into our plenary sessions. We have 3 plenary sessions. In breakout 1, we will have a plenary session on exhaustion and regeneration. In plenary breakout room 2, we have a discussion on home and back again. And in room 3, the session is on Newman and the journey into discovery. For those of you who were with us yesterday, you'll know that you should find a breakout room button at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to press that now, either room 1, 2 or 3, you will find yourselves in rooms 1, 2 and 3. If that button isn't there, if you let us know in chat, we will manually send you there. And we will see you back here in 45 minutes time. Please note that the rooms will automatically shut in 45 minutes time. So just to reiterate, in room
Back, room 2 are back.
stuff. Great. Okay, great stuff. Welcome back, Cara.
Actually, I thought you were picking this up. I'm sorry. So I was back sitting there naively. So I hope everybody enjoyed those parallel sessions. I've certainly gained a new insight into Tolkien, a book I read as a teenager and I'd never quite thought of in that way. So thank you very much for that. I'm delighted now to be able to move on to our final keynote of the day, and to introduce that keynote speaker. We have Alexander O'Hara. So Alexander, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you. So welcome to our next keynote session. My name is Alexander O'Hara. I'm a historian of early Christian Ireland and a research fellow in historical theology at the Loyola Institute. It's my privilege to introduce our next keynote speaker. Declan Kiberd is an emeritus professor of the University of Notre Dame at Dublin Gateway, having served for 10 years as Donald and Marilyn Keogh Professor of Irish Studies at Notre Dame. While there, he was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. For over 30 years, Declan taught Anglo-Irish literature at University College Dublin, and before that he lectured in Irish at Trinity College Dublin. He has been a director of the Abbey Theatre and of the Yeats International Summer School. Among his books are Sing and the Irish Language, Men and Feminism, Idir Gá Cultúr, Inventing Ireland, which won the Irish Times Prize, Irish Classics, winner of the Truman Capote Award, The Irish Writer and the World, Ulysses and Us, and After Ireland, Writing the Nation from Beckett to the Present. He co-edited with P.J. Matthews the Handbook of the Irish Revival, 1890 to 1921. He is currently working on 2 short books, one on England and Eternity about cricket, and the other, Beckett Undone, Mysticism Without God. This evening, Professor Kiberd will speak to us on the new Bloom Mausoleum, Ulysses as a Sacred Text, ? Declan, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you all for having me. And I'm sorry that a bit of an illness challenge has prevented a more complete involvement on my part in the sessions, but very, very pleased to be here. The American novelist William Faulkner once said that the only way to approach Joyce was with faith. The way, he said, a preacher approaches the Old Testament, and that's how I'm going to do it. One of Joyce's heroes was another author of epic, Walt Whitman, and he proposed his Leaves of Grass as a new Bible for a new continent. He said, the priest departs, the divine literatus comes. This wasn't the idea that the role of priests would be taken by poets. It was rather that the role of literature would return to its origins in forms of religion. And I often think that the key texts of high modernism climax in a Eucharistic moment. For instance, when the Madeleine is dipped in the tea in Proust's great book, or when Stephen Dedalus, who shocked his mother by refusing his Easter duty, nevertheless receives communion in a most unexpected way when a half-Jewish ad canvasser named Leopold Bloom offers him coffee and a bun. I've never seen Joyce as a secularist. Definitely he was anti-clerical, but he was not anti-religious. I think he believed so deeply in what his Jesuit teachers taught him that he was shocked only by the fact that most of them did not appear to do so themselves. And this is why he often said he found nobody in Ireland with a faith like his own. he felt that the Catholic Church in the 19th century had declined into a bureaucracy. Priests were the kind of non-commissioned officers of the emerging Catholic bourgeoisie. The presbytery had replaced the big house of the Anglo-Irish, and indeed the maltreatment of children replaced the droit de seigneur of the old aristocrats. And this bureaucracy administered schools and hospitals and social welfare, but had less interest in the next world. I think it's true, actually, that one of the reasons bureaucracies are so fixated on managing everything, on writing endless micro reports, is that they don't have any faith in a power that is all caring and all providing, that used to go by the name of God. But Joyce was a believer. His sister said, as a child, he was very religious. I think all of Jim's loves were recreated in the love of God. And his brother Stanislaus, who became a very strict atheist and who hero worshipped James, could never accept the religious element in his brother, but he explained it. He who has loved God in his youth can never love anything that is less than divine. Now, I think that element is often subliminally replicated by Joyce's keenest readers, who have turned Ulysses into a kind of sacred text. Joyce initiated another holy church, first of all, by designating a single day of the year on which to celebrate Bloom's communion with Stephen. Nobody in the book says, do this in memory of me, but every year the cult grows, and it has what all cults have. It has routes of pilgrimage to the tower and to the public house. It has special foods, liver and buns. It has its ritual observances, blessings and turnings, and of course, priestly decoders of the sacred text, people who make their living out of doing it, like me. Now, I note in passing that many of the surrealists who lived with Joyce in Paris had actually grown up as Catholics, but their displaced religion was filled with negative edicts and dogmas, above all, endless excommunications. By way of contrast, Joyce chose to appropriate the more celebratory aspects of Catholicism. And as with all cult formations, it has generated its own opposition. For instance, on the 16th of June, Bloomsday in 2004, 10,000 Bloomsday breakfasts were served on the streets of central Dublin to mark the great centenary. But a spray painter went to work and wrote "Bloom is a cod" on a building site wall. And there were no inverted commas around this direct quotation from the episode, which proclaims the mocked man as the founder of a new Bloom Museum. As I read through the book, Bloom is very skeptical, of course, of elements of the Catholic faith practiced around him. Because he's an ad man, he is very interested in the idea of repetition, in incantation. Pray for us and pray for us and pray for us. And he says, yes, buy from us and buy from us and buy from us. He's impressed by the financial power of the church and by its attention to detail. And when he watches the old ladies receiving communion at All Hallows, he says, good idea, the Latin stupefies them first. But of course, this is exactly what the book has done. Ulysses itself begins in Latin, intro ibo ad altare Dei, the opening words of the Latin Mass. And it comes to a grand climax when that good altar boy, Stephen, alters the gender of the responding God as he heads into the red light district and says, ad Deam qui laetificat juventutem meam, to the goddess who gives joy to my youth. Bloom looks at the effects of Catholic ritual, but he studies them like a modern anthropologist, or indeed as Carl Jung would have done. And he notices, as Jung did, how mingled ideas of sex and religion are. He thinks there must be a sexual element to the way in which the priest, wearing what he calls a laissez-faire, puts a thing in his hands and then puts it neatly into her mouth. Bloom is not trying to humiliate religion, just understand its appeal. The priest might seem womanly in his laissez-faire investments, a womanly man, but as such, he is a forecasting image of the new Bloom Museum, in the proclamation of which Bloom will be designated the new womanly man. And at the end of the book, Bloom will engage in a kind of reverse of the All Hallows operation when he is inseminated by his wife, Molly, the woman who will be his wife, and she kisses him among the flowers of Hoth Hill. But in doing so, she presses seed cake, the new viaticum, into Leopold's mouth. And that moment is preceded by many tender, more traditional versions of the Eucharist, as when, for instance, Bloom brings to animals bits of bread offered to the gulls swooping over the river Liffey. And when he gets into his imaginary bath, he looks down at his body, and no wonder he says, "Hoc est corpus meum," because this is a sacrificial story of a Bloom offered to suffer and to redeem the sins of fellow Dubliners. According to Francini Bruni, who was his close friend in Trieste, Joyce only completely admires the unchangeable, the mystery of Christ, and the mute drama that surrounds it. I can well imagine, Bruni went on, that his head was full of this mystery when he wrote Ulysses, and that therein lies the allegorical point of this story of a new martyrdom. Bruni noted how Joyce frequented the Catholic churches of Trieste all through Holy Week, so as not to miss a single syllable, and that he knew the Latin lines by heart, often whispering in time with the priest, even as he loitered in the porch, half in and half out. Bloom walks the streets of Dublin in Joyce's book, and he's given a handbill. Blue, question mark, B-L-O-O, question mark, no. Me, no. Blood of the Lamb, because what's being handed out is a handbill for a evangelical revival meeting. Elijah is coming. And Bloom's immediate disclaimer, no, not me, disclaimer of any possible role for him as a savior. This reflects the cautions of Jesus about any claims on his part to be a Messiah. The new Blue Musalem will only be announced many, many pages later, but for the present, Bloom is just godlike at certain moments. I think he is a repository of many Christ-like elements which his fellow drinkers in the pubs have rejected in themselves. They wrongly believe he's won money on a horse and is meanly refusing to buy a round of drinks. And so they convert him into a Jew, even though he isn't really one. But of course, a Jew, as Harold Rosenberg once said, is anyone whom others call a Jew. So when the nationalist citizen continues to taunt him, cute as a shithouse rat he is, he decides to become one pro tem, and he tells the men, your God was a Jew, Christ was a Jew, like me. Now, earlier in the book, Bloom would have contained or held that statement at the level of thought, Christ was a Jew like me, but now he blurts it out because he's tired and the day is advanced. The citizen had already disparaged him as the new Messiah for Ireland. Now the citizen throws a biscuit tin at Bloom and cries out, I'll crucify him, that I will. This is Bloom's penalty for telling them that love is the opposite of hatred, prelude to his saying that he must go now. That too is an unconscious repetition of a scene in the life of Jesus, a womanly man, who also served as a scapegoat for the local frustrations in a colonial setting. And it is at this strange moment that magic realism intrudes into the book. Bloom is born into the sky in a fiery chariot, ascending into the heavens, ut implerenter scriptures, so that the scriptures be fulfilled. And in this way, he turns Dublin into a heavenly city, a place touched at last by the divinity of his own presence. And I think all through the book, Bloom is so godlike that he can awaken consciousness in a cat or in a machine or in anything inanimate, in a table or chair. But whenever the possibility of his prophetic status had been raised, Bloom had been quick to deny it. No, he doesn't claim to be a hero. It's just like the Buddha says, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. And Jesus never came to claim to be the king of the Jews. In fact, in Ulysses, I-N-R-I just means, as Molly says, iron nails went right in. There are lots of moments in the book when Bloom considers the possibility of becoming a mother. And the book will indeed be born in the famous Nighttown chapter, where he is described as giving birth himself to a number of children. But before there's a birth, there has to be a death. And Ulysses therefore proceeds from a cemetery early on to the maternity hospital later still. I always think the book is in secret agreement with the statue of Parnell at the plinth at the end of O'Connell Street, in which he says, no man has the right to put the boundary to the march of a nation, but he's pointing straight to the nearest maternity hospital. This book is, of course, the epic of a human body, but it must include the numbering of bones and the piercing of hands and feet, as such, a post-death anatomical dissection. So after Bloom's mockery and ascent into heaven, we have in the maternity hospital episode a falling away of all the old genres to which Ulysses might have been likened: epic, Bible, play, novel, and instead is revealed after Minna Purefoy's 3-day wait for the birth of her child, a wholly strange new kind of language. You might call it a Pentecost, because at the end of the episode, you have all the old languages mangled and disintegrated into tongues of fire, and a kind of newness supervenes to announce a new dispensation. I think Joyce had glee in destroying the forms of traditional European literature, but this had a positive side as well. The destruction of any old genre contains within itself the first lineaments of the new one. So the account of the collapse of any civilization contains, in a sense, the master narrative of the one that will replace it. I would say that all sacred texts come out of disorder. T.S. Eliot once, I think, wrongly thought that Joyce used Homer's Odyssey as a way of imposing a model of order on the chaos of modern life. But the whole point about the Odyssey is it's filled with chaos itself. It's trying to impose order on a world whose paradigms have been exploded by the sheer distance which Odysseus has gone to throw into question all the old teachings. And the knowledge Odysseus brings back from those distant travels, it's like the knowledge that Joyce brings back from the unconscious. It requires a kind of recoding of the whole world. All these projects see themselves as reworking past knowledge and exposing its merely mythical status, as Adorno and Horkheimer have often said, of giving to its stories, all of a sudden though now, the feel of actual experience. What was once merely mythical or fictional becomes actual. Odysseus refused to eat the lotus, and he anticipated in that the deferred gratification practiced by Jesus and by Bloom. The present sacrifices itself to the future. So the Odyssey must defer some of its gratifications to the New Testament, as the Old Testament does, and they all defer more still to Ulysses. Odysseus saves his life by losing his name, just as Bloom in the book becomes the man and then just a man. As Jesus said, whoever loses life saves it. And in all of these narratives, there's something in common. You have a passive, caring figure who achieves semi-divine status by a kind of anonymous celebrity. The story of Jesus, of course, as Eric Auerbach said, was to illustrate how ordinary fisher folk could become extraordinary, how the widow's mite would count as much as the king's ransom. But my argument is it took literature nearly 2,000 years to catch up with the truth of Jesus in the figure of Bloom. Even in Shakespeare, low people are the butt of comedy. Even in Tolstoy in the late 19th century, only aristocrats are allowed to have interior monologues. When Odysseus bribed the monster with drink, saying, "Wine goes well with human flesh," Bloom instead offers gently his coffee and bun. Sacrifice was once made to the gods, but now it will be made by godlike humans to themselves. So I'm saying that the manifest content of the Odyssey and the Bible fall away like scaffolding to reveal the latent content of Ulysses. You could see this as a repetition of those moments when the life of Jesus gives the poetic metaphors of the Old Testament the pressure of felt actual experience. The humiliating death of the pretender who was mocked with the crown of thorns threw the claims of his followers into doubt. So the New Testament had to ransack the Old Testament for moments when the life of Jesus is prefigured. And Bloom's ascension is likewise prefigured by Mark the Evangelist. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming into the clouds of heaven. And the book works all through like that. Newsboys walk behind Bloom, mimicking his walk. And it's like what was said in the Psalms, thy enemies mock the footsteps of thy anointed. The chariot is straight out of Elijah. A literature operating like this, I think, is working by more than a set of analogies. It's providing a secret lore as phrases deliberately echoed from the older texts take on an extra depth in the new one. They fulfill in actions the words, but also the intentions of a special person. And of course, the elements of the latent sacred text have a utopian thrust, a power to shape future ones. There's always a danger, and it's been pointed out by many theologians in such writing, that it can lead to a kind of provincializing present tensism, as if the latest text is history's cutting edge, that Christianity is a kind of trump card played to show the outdatedness of Judaism as Jesus surpassed Moses. But Joyce knew all of this, and he knew it would apply to him and to his sacred texts. That if his text could be reconfigured by gifted revisers, that's what he had done to the past. This was going to be done to Ulysses itself, which would be cannibalized. And he actually begins the process in the book itself. He knew that those who humble themselves would be exalted. And that is why he quotes George Russell. The movements which work revolutions in the world are born out of those dreams and visions of peasant's heart on a hillside. And the authority of those ransacked texts is never really fully exploded. Its continuing existence is necessary to help make sense of the expanded new dispensation. And that's why Joyce wrote, Jew Greek is Greek Jew. This perception is as old as St. Paul, the first internationalist, who said that there's neither slave nor free man, since everyone is one in Christ Jesus. And he tried, St. Paul, to universalize the Torah, yet not all the early Christians were so tolerant. And we hear echoes of those debates all through Ulysses. One of the Dubliners asks Bloom, what is your Christian name? This always reminds me of a moment when our Taoiseach, Liam Cosgrave, first had the headship of the European Commission. And this was when Ireland had first the position of temporary authority in the European Union. And he was asked what would he do about the troubles in the Middle East. And he said, oh, indeed, the Jews and the Arabs should solve their problems by peaceful Christian means. And when a journalist said to him, Mr. Cosgrave, that might not go down very well in the Gaza Strip or in Jerusalem, he said, it will go down very well in Dunleary, where my constituents live. But you get that kind of notion, that provincialism all through this book. Bloom's face is compared by another Dubliner to his face is like our Saviour's. And yet Bloom himself is forever open to his own strangeness in a way that these speakers are not. And the emphasis in the New Testament, of course, is on the humanity of Jesus. The fact that he's a foretold king is kept more or less secret. But this makes the evolution of higher forms of humanity possible, the human form divine, in the words of William Blake. And the identity of a Messiah, like Bloom's, is really, I think, an open space into which people can read whatever they want. A space, moreover, which disrupts all the official codes with which it's brought into contact. And this became a running joke for Jesus. Who do men say that I am? And a list would then be given. Nino Frank said that Joyce's privacy was the privacy of someone entering a religious order. I think that's true. I think that Joyce worked on a borderline between religion and a kind of throwaway mysticism. He liked to remind people that the Catholic Church, like the See of Peter, was founded on a pun. And when Gertrude Stein said sarcastically that Ulysses was both incomprehensible, but any ordinary person could understand it, she was really mocking its growing reputation among those ex-Catholic surrealists of Paris. its reputation as a sacred text, which is why I think Faulkner was right to approach the book with faith. Thank you very much.
Declan, thank you. Thank you for that stimulating and entertaining talk. We're very glad that you have been able to join us today. That's been fabulous.
Pleasure to be with you.
What we'd like to do now is to open the floor. So this is a chance for you to share your thoughts and reflections, perhaps as a result that have been sparked by what you've heard from Declan just now, but also on the theme of literary journeys that we've been exploring over the course of today. If you'd like to contribute to that open floor, then you can raise your Zoom hand, or you could try the old-fashioned wave, and I'll do my best to spot you on screen. And equally, as you're listening to other people perhaps speaking, you can add your thoughts and reflections in chat as well, so that the chat function should be enabled now. Who would like to kick us off? There's been so much covered today, hasn't there? I'm sure there are some reflections to share. I'm scanning, I'm looking for those waves. Robert, I can see you. There we go. Over to you.
Have I muted myself? Have I done so successfully?
We can hear you loud and clear.
I just wondered to Declan whether Ulysses isn't better considered to be a kind of anti-Bible rather than a holy text. I did an edition about 20 years ago of a book that much influenced Joyce, which was Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough. And in my Oxford addition to that, published in 1994, I reconstituted or analyzed The Golden Bough as a sort of anti-Bible. And I'm wondering whether you couldn't do the same to Ulysses.
I think you could. And in a way, that's what I was saying, that it picked up on elements of old Bibles in a somewhat parodistic way, but still taking them seriously, but trying to make them more literally real. I once did write an essay arguing that Ulysses is certainly an anti-epic, because one of the characters in the middle of the book in the library scene says, our national epic has still to be written. Yeah. Moore is the man for it. And someone then says, good idea. And the reader is supposed to think, no, you've got the wrong guy. This is it in your hand, you know. So I think it is kind of anti-epic, anti-Bible, even in some ways anti-drama. And it's part of a wider rebellion by Joyce against the uses of literature and the abuses, as he sees it, of literature from, I suppose, the time of medieval Europe to the present. And he is trying to return it to more religious type uses. Now, he would probably argue that there's huge critiques of Bibles, in most Bibles anyway, worthy of the name. And my old teacher, Elman, who was the great Joyce scholar, I once said to him, you know, do you not think Joyce was a bit anti-Irish? And he said, yes, but he was anti-Irish in a very Irish way. So my answer to you would be, he was anti-biblical in a very biblical way too.
It reminds me of what Eliot said about only a believer can blaspheme. If
yes.
you regard Joyce as being a blasphemer, that's
yes.
evidence of his gut
Yes, and it was always said of religious and clerical students that they concocted the most bawdy and blasphemous songs in Latin. I remember, I'm old enough to have been an altar boy, Qui tecum vivat et regnat, and Joyce rewrote it in Finnegan's Wake about dirty underpants, quick take him, whip him and drain it. But that kind of mockery of the holy text is only possible to those who have, as his sister said, belief. It's like the kind of point that came up during the Rushdie controversy about the satanic verses, that there can be no blasphemy if there is no belief. And the fact that there is a kind of blasphemy felt is a sure sign that belief is still strong.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that great question. And thank you, Declan. Anybody else? David Lonsdale. You'll just need to unmute, David.
Right. Thank you for that, Declan. Can I ask you, to what extent you think that Joyce is steeped in or influenced by the typological readings of scripture, and to what extent he's kind of ironizing those as well.
He had a very good Jesuit education, as I'm
Yes, I
sure
know.
you know. And he said that the Jesuits did two great things. They taught him how to order and how to judge.
Mm-hmm.
And his father added to that how systemic a mind they had developed in him, that if the son had been dropped into the Sahara Desert, he would sit by God and make a map of it. I think he knew the New Testament, as most of us Catholics did growing up in Ireland, better than the Old. I certainly did. And I think I got an education rather like Joyce's. And in the same way, he would have known a lot more of Latin than he did of Greek, which makes the fact that he used the Greek basis of the Homer's Odyssey all the more interesting, because it wasn't an obvious choice. I think he chose Odysseus because he was a draft dodger, didn't want to go to war. And this was coming out of a Dublin which was filled with military uses, to which Gaelic heroes, epic heroes like Cuchulainn were being put. But I'm interested in the fact that you have been discussing journeys, because it's often been pointed out to me by the people in Penguin books that the Odyssey sold in its Black Penguin Classic version many more times copies than the Iliad, because it's a book about movement, travel, even the modern touristic idea of trying to learn about yourself by exploring the world. So yes, I think he was very well steeped in sacred literature. And as I said at the outset, he knew the rite of Holy Week by heart.
Yes, and there I think, you know, figures like the suffering servant and the kind of the types, or the types who are kind of seen as being fulfilled in the life of Christ. To what extent did he understand those and use them? And to what extent was he kind of taking an ironic stance?
Yeah, well, I think he seems to me to have had huge admiration for the wise passiveness of Jesus. You know, to steal a phrase from Wordsworth. He was once asked why he didn't use Jesus rather than Odysseus as the model, since Bloom has so many qualities in common. And he said the reason was that Jesus had many virtues, but he had never lived with a woman. And living with a woman is the most difficult thing a man has to do, and Jesus never did it. which is, of course, in these days of Me Too, an appalling statement. But I think I know what he meant. There was you know, the whole thing about Odysseus was he was a family man, but a family man who had to go on the run. But the whole story is about coming back to the faithful Penelope and identifying each other by these almost secret symbols.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Declan. I would love to continue this conversation, but I'm very aware of the time and that we're approaching the end of today's session. So what I'd like to do now is hand to Michael Kirwan for his reflections on today and a look ahead to tomorrow and our Atrium Day tomorrow. So Michael.
Thank you very much. And thank you once again, Declan, for that splendid presentation. This is a kind of sum up of day two. Building on David's summary from yesterday, the first day of the conference, for me, demonstrated so many of the fine qualities which I've associated with the power of the word over its 10-year history. Above all, a shared enthusiasm and excitement about the reverberations between religious faith and poetic and literary endeavour. As David Jasper and David Lonsdale reminded us, with John Henry Newman's Grammar of Assent, we have a powerful account of an analogy between these two ways of striving for meaning and truth. I'm celebrating the fact that we are scholars from different disciplines, and also that our company includes practitioners as well as theorists, but we belong in the same room together, even if that room is, for this year, a virtual one. So our conversation calls for a hermeneutics of generosity in two directions. The first place is we strain to listen to scholars from other disciplines, to decipher their strange terminology, and at least to attempt to sympathize with assumptions which are not necessarily our own. Secondly, we listen to the creators, the poets we are so fortunate to have among us. We listen to their poetic words, but also to their own self-descriptions, sometimes assertive, sometimes tentative, about what is going on for them. So our discussion, therefore, contains moments of intimacy, exchanges of confidence, which I, for one, do not normally associate with academic conferences. I value this and I celebrate it, and I hope that this wonderful intellectual friendship will continue and will deepen over the coming days. But I also hope for moments of disagreement and tension as we discover areas where there is work to do, either in correcting misunderstandings or in refining our awareness of genuine difference. Because one of the central themes of our conversation is that literature, faith, and philosophical assertion do not always pull in the same direction. There is dialectic as well as analogy. One of my memories of a previous Power of the Word conference was a question which came up in a plenary session put by a scholar of literature to the theologians who were present. What did we understand by heresy? And I have to say the question took me aback, because heresy is not a word I use very much in my own teaching. But the import of the question was clear. Are we theologians only playing at dialogue? When push comes to shove, do we not fall back on truths or dogmas to be asserted and falsehoods which need to be anathematized? Same question is put to philosophers. At what point is the poet in danger of being expelled once again? Because he or she is not ultimately beholden to the truth, or at least not to the right kind of truth. The question has not gone away, and I look forward to seeing how the rubber hits the road at this conference. If it does not, then we are missing an important dimension of this dialogue. Thankfully, the patroness of our conversation this afternoon would never allow this to happen. Flannery O'Connor, introduced to us in the marvelous film of her life and work, was notoriously prickly towards modern attempts at an aesthetic displacement of truth. In her letters, she refers contemptuously to a generation of what she calls wingless chickens, chickens which have been genetically mutated so as to be more tasty, but which are unable to fly. Her generation, she complained, was incapable of understanding her fiction because the capacity for moral and religious seriousness had been bred out of it. O'Connor's frustrated inability to communicate effectively because she does not have the readership which she needs or deserves sounds similar to the incapacity of the church to pass on its wisdom and tradition. It might also be a description of the crisis of legitimacy in contemporary politics, as norms of civic discourse and democratic accountability, once taken for granted, are now being ruthlessly scrutinized. In all these cases, the burning question is still the one asked by Pontius Pilate. Not what is heresy, but what is truth? For decades, the Western Academy has played loosely with the notion of truth. We are seeing now the consequence of a turn to the aesthetic, which has left us vulnerable to fascism once more. The wingless chickens have come home to roost. I'm pleased that today's proceedings have been bookmarked, so to speak, by two modernist writers who are emblematic of this crisis, Flannery O'Connor and James Joyce, each sensitive to the modernist imperative to make it new, and yet neither abandons the commitments of the past in their use of Thomism and in the creative refashioning of myth. Each author is supersaturated in Catholicism. Each is aware of the need for a certain amount of destruction before grace can do its work. To cite Michael Murphy, the devil must be given his due. Declan has reminded us of the sacred dimensions of Ulysses as a sacred text, that wonderful presentation. But it's perhaps in the short stories of Joyce, Dubliners, and in O'Connor, A Good Man is Hard to Find, that the existential contest of grace and its antonyms, fear, prejudice, paralysis, violence, it's here where the contest is most vividly expressed. Thinking of the stories, two stories of Finnish Dubliners, one entitled Grace, and yet it's a kind of parody of the understanding of grace. And then the final story of Dubliners, The Dead, which gives you some sense of what grace really is about. And then contrast that with The Artificial Nigger, which is a story by Flannery O'Connor, once again narrating a journey, a pilgrimage, which finds a surprising, graceful moment at its conclusion. David Lonsdale has pointed us to the spiritual and moral ambivalence of the call to literature. There's much in O'Connor and in Joyce to delight us, but there's also an unmistakable summons to humane responsibility. To paraphrase Philip Larkin in his poem Church-Going, in these writers we surprise a hunger in ourselves to be more serious. In a moment, I'm going to ask Eileen to conclude the proceedings with a poem, but I just want to say a word about the Atrium Day, which is happening tomorrow. A very brief word. I think it's been introduced to us already, that the original plan for this conference was for 4 days with a rest day, with a break. However, we were missing out on the bumping into people in the hallways, the lunch queues, the coffee stations, and the unplanned conversations. So what we want to try and do tomorrow is to replicate these serendipitous encounters online. And what will happen is that tomorrow at 2 o'clock, 1400 hours UK time, we are planning what's called an online Atrium Day, an informal group of meeting rooms based on discussion topics. We're generating a list of potential topics and they're allocating them to individual Zoom breakout rooms. You can then choose a room with a subject which appeals to you, and there will be a 30-minute discussion. At the end of the half hour, the rooms will be closed, and you can suggest other breakout room discussion topics, or you can return to the room where you spent the first session for the second round. So we'll have 4 times 30-minute sessions. We can alter the number of breakout rooms depending on demand. The conference tabula has a section to add ideas for room discussions, so please feel free to add any suggestions. So I suggest you simply log on to the conference login tomorrow and see what happens, and you'll be guided, and hopefully that will be a good set of further encounters, more informal than formal sessions or presentations, but hopefully very, very worthwhile. We look forward to seeing as many of you as possible tomorrow. Thank you for your presence at a very stimulating and very rich day. There is something in the chat further from Liz on that, Morris, what I've just mentioned, and the link for the tabula is also in the chat. So thank you for your presence today. I hope you've had a good day, and I'm going to ask Eileen to conclude our proceedings with some poem too. Eileen, over to you. And you need to unmute.
Thank you very much. And I should start by apologizing for the debacle or shambles yesterday. Because this is about the power of the word, I'm going to read one poem, which is called J'ai mal à nos dents, which you will understand as meaning I have a pain in our teeth. It's written in memory of my aunt, whose name was Anna Cullinan, but who went by Sister Mary Anthony. And it's about the way in which, when you enter into the sacred space, the meanings of words change. I'll translate, I probably don't need to, but I will translate the French phrases. J'ai mal à nos dents. The Holy Father gave her leave to return to her father's house at 78 years of age. When young, in the Franciscan house at Calais, she complained to the dentist, "I have a pain in our teeth." Her body dissolving out of her first mother, her 5 sisters aching at home. Her brother listened to news 5 times in a morning on Radio Éireann in Cork as the Germans entered Calais. Her name lay under the surface. He could not see her working all day with the sisters, stripping the hospital, loading the sick on lorries, while Reverend Mother walked the wards and nourished them with jugs of wine to hold their strength. J'étais à moitié saoul. I was half pissed. It was, they lifted the old sisters onto the pig cart, and the young walked out on the road to Dèvres, the wine still buzzing and the plains over their heads. Je mangerai les pissenlits par les racines. I'll be eating dandelions by the roots. I'll be pushing up daisies. I'll be dead. Je mangerai les pissenlits par les racines. A year before she died, she lost her French accent, going home in her habit to care for her sister Nora, une malade à soigner une malade. They handed her back her body, its voices, and its death. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And we wish you all a very good night. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the Atrium Day tomorrow and also on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you.